So, Michelene, good to speak to you, and to speak to you about not just one book that you've published, but three, all in 2021. So let's get this right, so that people can see not only the collection of poetry Travellers, not only
one,
not only 4 times 81,
2
bespoke stories, 2, but also in 2021, a reader anthology of various pieces through history on the topic of the critical, the creative, the imagination, etc. So, can you explain yourself, Michelene? What's been going on? What have you been on?
Okay, I'll tell you. I've been on the present and the past. Travellers came out at the very beginning of 2021, and it was my most recent poetry collection, and it went in for the RAF because that's what they want.
Oh, yes, yes.
That was, I should have said output 1, output 2, output 3, shouldn't I?
You could have.
Terribly sorry. So output 1 was a poetry collection which was finished the previous year, then got held up because of COVID and the RAF. REF, not RAF, and the publishers were held up as well because everything got put back. Otherwise, it would have come out in 2020. So that was that one. The stories are in time terms COVID related, but they absolutely had nothing direct at all to do with COVID. It was a very different impetus that got them going, which we can talk about a little bit, and which I describe very briefly in the introduction to the stories. But the timing, again, it was coincidental, but it happened to be across that first year. And then it got to the point where I basically kind of realized I had as many stories as I was going to do. So I stopped. And it was then published by, well, we can talk about that as well. Now, The Reader, in many ways, is a much more interesting story because it was originally commissioned by, I'm trying to remember, Continuum Books, who'd published one of my other non-fiction books in about 2009, 2010. So I did a massive amount of work, got all the stuff together, submitted it, it was accepted. And then there was the merry-go-round of permissions, which one has to get for any piece that is still in copyright. And that is, in principle, this is accepted practice rather than any law, but it's a convention, any piece that is over 400 words. You can have 800 words if they're in 2 different places, that's kind of allowed to be kosher. The publishers wanted me to do all the chasing for permissions, write the letters. They did a little bit, but I did most of it, which was a nightmare. This is where I want to begin swearing, but I'm not going to. And of course, not everybody replied. People who did reply, very occasionally there was somebody who said, yeah, you don't need to pay. Then there was somebody who was probably T.S. Eliot, the executors, the estate, whatever, who wanted hundreds of pounds. And then there were other people who wanted a bit less. No way was I going to pay for permissions because I got an absolutely swear-worthy tiny advance. But I did the book because I felt very strongly about it and I wanted to do it. The publishers were prepared to put a small amount of money towards the permissions, but it wouldn't have covered it. So I let the thing drop because it wasn't going to happen. Anyway, time passed, life went on, all kinds of things happened. And then I was just going through all sorts of back stuff, deciding what I wanted to keep, chuck away, develop, whatever. And every single section was there. I printed everything out. I had everything. I had it all online. And I went through it and I thought, I'm going to swear a bit. I thought, sod it. This is still needed. This is still good. It's going to get done. I then approached Bloomsbury, who'd bought up Continuum, and spoke to a completely different editor, understandably, explained the history. I said it was commissioned, it was accepted, it was all ready, permissions, blah, blah, blah. She said, yes, it sounds great, but I'm afraid you have to go through the process from scratch because we're all new here. she was very keen. I did some work, resubmitted a proposal, which was the same proposal, but explaining the history and basically saying, I hope you'll do it now. And it then came back, and she was obviously following orders and gave me a series of reasons about why they didn't want to do it, all of which had been answered in the initial re-proposal. So swear again, I just thought we had a little to and fro, which didn't go anywhere because I knew it wouldn't. And I think the principle at that end was that if something had already been commissioned and never seen the light of day, they didn't want to touch it again. That's what I really think it was, although they may also not have wanted to enter the permissions arena, which is understandable. Well, it isn't, but it is. So that is self-published. And we're not here to talk about self-publishing, although it might come up. Yes, The Reader is self-published.
Beautifully done. Beautifully done. Just for
they've done a fantastic job. They did a fantastic job, and it was relatively quick, relatively decent working process. If anybody ever buys it, and if I ever get any money back, I'll be lucky. But that is a question we can come on to. Not about whether I'm going to be lucky, but whether anybody will buy it. So the history of each of these books is rather different, and it came to pass that they all came out last year. So it's great. I don't think I've ever had 3 books in the same year, although because I've done a huge amount for radio, I have had years when I've had a number of plays and dramatizations all on in the same year. But again, that's a different kind of story. So that's answering that.
Okay, well, we'll go through. We'll get on to the Reader, the anthology that you've just been discussing. We'll get on to the stories, if that's what they are. But let's start with the volume Travellers.
Yes.
And so, very striking line, I suppose, for me, in one of the early poems, San Menalto, where it's a poem where involving some sort of drama teacher figure. It's full of prose as well. And then suddenly in the middle of this poem, you have the lines, I am the poet, space, I sit alone. And then a subsequent poem, actually Beached, you talk about the horizon exuding a false solitude. So can I ask you perhaps to talk about aloneness and being a poet, and yet these poems are very often poems where you feel far from alone, in the sense that you're surrounded by history, allusion, the history of music, the history of literature, and so on and so on. So they're very full texts, almost cluttered in the best possible sense, but yet you've got this very striking counter thought. I am the poet, I sit alone. Could you talk to that at all?
In the context of the poem, it's about me being separate from this course in Italy, although I was part of it as well. So I was kind of sitting on my own at a table, right? But of course, in the sense, I think, maybe in which you're asking it, writing has to happen alone. I mean, obviously, you can sit in a cafe, you can sit anywhere and write, but the engagement, the dialogue, is between the mind, the brain, the imagination, and the paper or the screen. And whatever influences that, which can come from all kinds of places, other people, past, whatever, research, reading, anything, that is where it's filtered. Obviously, that is also true of any kind of writing, academic writing. You know, you do what you do in your context, you then sit down to write the book, and it's you in the book. And it is, it has to be in that sense. There's no way around it, I don't think. It has to be an isolated and an isolating experience. And that's actually what's very exciting about it. You have to be alone because you have to be alone. You can end up being terribly lonely, very easy to be very lonely, lots of times, but that's the nature of the work. So it's no more, it's not mystical, but it is intellectual work. As I said before, whatever feeds in, and things feed in all the time and go out again, has to be done between the individual mind ultimately, if it is going to be written, if it is going to be published, if it's going to be read. And that's just how it is. There's no way out of it. And there shouldn't be, actually. There shouldn't be, because it is not just the life of the mind, but it's a particular kind of activity of the mind. I don't know if that answers it enough. I mean, I don't fetishize it. I think it's a condition of the job. You know, if you're making cars, you work in a factory, you might be on a conveyor belt. It's a condition of the job. You can't do it anywhere else. You can't write it any other way.
Right. Yes, you don't want to fetishize it. You don't want to talk about the mystical. There is that wonderful line, however, perhaps from Auden, and I don't know, forget where it comes from, which is about the from the alone, I think with a small a, to the alone, I think with a capital A, which is inviting us to wonder, what is this aloneness, or is there an aloneness to it? Or would you say, no, there's some, it's just alone with a capital, with a lowercase a. It's functional.
No, yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know kind of where you would go with the Auden with a capital A, how you would go behind that. But I think it probably relates to what I'm saying, which is that no one who writes anything, poetry, academic, history books, whatever, is free from their context, their history, the ideologies which inform them, some of which they're aware of, some of which they may not be. But when push comes to shove, the act of writing is the small a. It's between you, it's between me, and what I put down in language. I mean, language is the medium. Language is the material medium, obviously also the message. But if I don't do it, it won't be done. No one else can do what I do out of my head, whatever the quality of that. And so in that sense, it is a product of the individual mind. And I'm not fetishizing it and saying it's better than other things that individual minds can do, or that minds can do together in other circumstances. But the act of writing, like the act of painting, I mean, it's like, I would compare it, well, not to any art form, because there are group art forms, obviously, theatre, dance, music. But I think writing and painting, I suppose, sculpture, perhaps, share that, even though the media are different. But unless have you got something theological behind your capital?
No, I'll leave it at that. No, I suppose I might ask you, you mentioned language. To what extent does language constitute company, as it were, not being alone? You're particularly the short stories are very sort of self-conscious, or very self-conscious about language and individual letters. To what extent do they constitute the writer's company?
Well, you can do it in so many different ways. I talk a lot in my house. I mean, at the moment, I live on my own.
Right.
Occasionally, some other presence may turn up or is allowed, but I talk a lot. And if I can't find my shoes, I call them. And
Right.
You probably shouldn't tell anybody this.
No, don't worry, no one will know.
That was it. So language does so many things. Language does so many things. Right. Company, that's the word company. This has just come to mind, but there are bits of things that I've written sometimes that really make me laugh because I think they're funny.
Yeah, there are some great lines.
Well, other people might not find them funny.
Well, when I play Hamlet, I know who will win. It's very good.
It's good, that, isn't it?
Very good. Very, very good.
I'm sure someone said it somewhere, but anyway.
I've not heard it before, no. no, never.
But language is I suppose, again, without fetishizing it, language is my thing. Because I would never be able to run for a marathon, because I could never even run for a bus. So language became not just talking and conversation or whatever, but language became my thing because I became a writer. I was able to earn my living as a writer. So language is my thing.
Okay.
Whether that you would call that company or not, I don't know. I don't think I'd want to be without it. That's not really company, is it?
No. Well, I don't know. Without it or without them, I don't know if it's plural, if language is plural or singular.
Both, probably.
Both, perhaps. Yes. I mean, you kind of break apart language, don't you? And particularly, again, in the short stories, breaks apart into individual letters and so on. And I've been talking of the multiple or multiplicity, I suppose, in the poems. What the poems are multiple, I suppose, in the sense each poem is a kind of poems, in that they're collagist, full of quotation, full of history, and very often, yes, collagist. Would you, or how would you speak to that? I mean, Virginia Woolf said of Auden, back to Auden, that his poems were clogged with fact.
Oh.
And you're quite prepared to risk that too.
Yeah.
Amongst other things.
Oh yeah.
Which is wonderful. So yeah, how would you talk about this collagist instinct, or this or semi-quotational instinct?
Well, there are two approaches to that. Well, not two, they sort of combine. I was actually thinking about that, before we started, because I knew we were going to talk about it. What I tend not to do, I had done it in the past now and again, what I tend not to do is follow in what has, I think, become the kind of the modern contemporary nowish lyric convention, which really derives from the schools movements of confessional poetry of the 50s and the 60s, when the self, the autobiographical self, disguised or not, because you can never know, that lyrical I, which is mostly read autobiographically, is at the center of the poem. And there are books and books and books and books of poetry that do that. And at one level, there's nothing wrong with that, because they are deploying language in a distilled way to place some kind of I, some kind of selfness. Now, I don't do that, although I am in every single poem. But I don't do it via the I don't do it via the lyric, because other things I think are more important and more interesting. And the subjects, if you like, the contents of many of these poems are things that I've become very involved with in all sorts of other ways, through music, through drama. What you're calling collagic is interesting that you put it like that, actually. And I can see why you're saying it. One of the things about the book is that typographically, there's Roman, there's italics, there's bold.
Yes.
I've written masses and masses of drama always, since the very beginning of when I was writing. I've written a huge amount of drama. So there is a kind of, if you like, a dialogic, I might say, maybe alongside what you're calling collagic,
right, yes,
theme that runs through the book, the poems, which means they're not necessarily that easy to read. You can read them in any way you like. You can read them down the page, line after line. They're not all the same. There are some which are just like, thank God, just one single poem. But they can be read in different ways, and they probably will get read. Yeah, they will get read in different ways. And sometimes there's more than one poem, more than one story, but they are in dialogue with each other. So the layout is very important from that point of view. And so they're facts. A lot of them are historically placed. Palestine, George Bernard Shaw, just whizzing through. Others are not, but they still have this sort of split level. The Colour of Botany, which is about saffron, I suppose, started off as being about saffron. The Harrison, the Clock of Heaven, longitude, the discovery, as it were, the fixing of longitude, which I also wrote a play for Radio 4 about. So there are a lot of overlaps. And the Palestine one, I also wrote a play set in 1917, which was a stage play, quite a short stage play.
All right.
So some of these also come from other forms I've written in, just as in some of my other poetry books, pieces of performed music and words that I put together. The words have ended up as self-standing poems, which have then been published in the poetry books.
Yes.
So the relationship between music and words is both there, but also separable. So I don't know how much that explains it. And I'm sure there will be people who think they're clogged with facts, too hard to read, put it aside, go and look for something nice and simple that said, I broke up with my boyfriend. Oh God, I've got a rose on the wall. You know, sorry, I don't write that kind of thing.
No,
I just wrote it.
You just have, yes. I suppose that's very interesting to hear that sense of the, as it were, the dramatic prehistory almost or the dialogic prehistory of the poems, and you are doing the police in many voices and so on. It is that polyvocal in that way, and that's works really, really well. Sort of relatedly, perhaps, can I ask you, that's one last question, really, Travellers, and that's to do with its kind of Englishness and un-Englishness. And there's a nice, some wonderful juxtapositions. For instance, he has been sent to bring her to Cairo. She has brought Shakespeare, maps, which is wonderful lines.
Those are true. Gertrude Bell and Lawrence of Arabia. No, that was that, you know, research shows sometimes you have to be careful with that, but straight out the books.
Is that that's not quotation though, that's research?
No, it's not quotation, but they're facts. I mean, she took lavatory seats with her because that's what British travellers, particularly when they were aristocratic, obviously, and had money and could do it, and took servants. They took it all with them.
Even the lavatory seats?
Yeah. Well, what else are you going to do? Sit in a hole in the ground?
I'm not, no. Yeah, and that's very, very striking. And the taking the Shakespeare all the way to Cairo.
Yes.
You juxtapose it with maps. As if Shakespeare is your English map wherever you might go, even if it is to Cairo.
Foretaste of the British Council, you might say.
Well, yeah, talk to us about that, because the poems are constantly doing that jarring of the English and the un-English, it seems to me.
Yeah. That's interesting. That is interesting. It's interesting that you comment on that. Is your question about me or about what's in, or both?
Or probably both, but whichever. You don't have to talk about me at all. But
well, it is related. It must be related.
Related to
I couldn't pin it down probably totally. But I'm British, but I don't actually feel very English.
Right.
Sometimes at all English, although English is my language. My substantive education is English, although it didn't start till I was 14 for various reasons. But I'm obviously very badly brought up because I don't, I'm not very good at the right codes of conduct. I kind of know what they are, but I'm not very good at them. And sometimes I think they're wrong and I transgress and do all sorts of things. But it's a complete contradiction because everything about what I might say me culturally is English and the language is English. And So I'm that, but then I am not. I am not feeling. I am not feel English. I do have other languages, not as fluent, of course.
Yeah.
But that's not the only reason, because lots of other people have lots of languages, but they're still very English in their Englishness. But I think I probably would say that my writing is English,
Right.
and that things that go into it come from the English tradition. So, for example, it's not like German, it's not like French, it's not like Italian, where in literature, generalizations and abstractions are very common and very acceptable. And we are an empirical linguistic culture. And we haven't come to the reader yet, but there's a whole chunk taken from Quilla Cooch at the very beginning of the 20th century, which absolutely stamps that. And it's still the case, even if I've broken up with my boyfriend and I haven't got any flowers in the vase anymore, kind of thing. Flowers vase, right? But I don't go on about the anguish and the sorrow and the heartbreak. It comes through something material and something empirical more. And so from that point of view, I think I'm English, and maybe that explains the clogging of facts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Interleaving of facts and voices.
Yes. And I suppose, however, it's the interleaving of languages and text, if you want to use jargon, intertextual nature of what you're doing, that perhaps feels more continental.
Does it?
Yes.
Really? That's interesting.
Yes.
Can you say something about that? Because
well, I
that's
suppose
that's for the reader. That's not for me, I don't think.
Yeah, I suppose I'm vaguely thinking, I guess, of surrealist habits of
oh yeah, okay.
the mix of text, and I think of that as a continental event, or at least primarily or initially, rather than British or English.
But it depends whether I get it from there or whether I do it. I was going to say something out. Well, I don't know if it makes any sense. Whether I do it out of a sense of not quite belonging. That
right. So why did you, to go back a sec, why did you not start formal education until you were 14?
Oh, it's terrible, terrible, terrible sob story. I was very ill. I had asthma very badly. Before they really knew about allergies, before there were the kinds of inhalers. I mean, I still have asthma. Before there were the kinds of inhalers, which means that people stay alive rather than not. And then, and I was sent away from home a lot. I hope you've got your handkerchief ready. No, you haven't. No, it's all right. And then there was 4 years in Israel when my parents and I went because I was little. They decided to go and live in the newly established Israeli state in 1949. And so we were there for 4 years. So although I did speak Hebrew, I was never totally fluent. And my schooling there was zilch, and I was ill there, and I got sent away a lot. So between being very small and 14, when we finally came back, and I started going to school in London. Sob story, I was sent away 6 times because I was ill, and so ill at home that not because of my parents, but because of allergies and cats and feathers and carpets and all that stuff and dust and the war. And after the war as well. So I was sent away a huge amount. So even though there may have been tiny bits of schooling in between, I have very little memory. There was no continuous schooling. Right. So I'm autodidact, which may also explain some of the clogging of facts, because everything I have, as it were, learned, apart from English, French and German, which I did at A-level, and then English at Cambridge. Everything has come from me needing and wanting to find out about it. So in that sense, I really am quite autodidactic, although all the English stuff has infused too, because I did all of that as well.
Yes.
So it's a weird mixture. It's a weird collage, I suppose.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, an interesting one. Yes. Thank you. That's interesting. Okay, well, if we move across to 4 times 81,
Oh, yeah.
perhaps you
I
could
like.
just kindly explain the premise to each of these texts.
Okay, I'll briefly say how it started. There's a very short introduction. I met somebody in a cafe who has a young adult son who has been labelled autistic. I hate the label autistic. I hate autistic spectrum, so we'll ignore that. But the things that he needs constant kind of, he functions with constant care and supervision. She, amazingly, when he was very little and had no language, worked with him, with other people in the family, on an American program, which meant she taught him to read, to speak, to read and write. Amazing, amazing. Absolutely amazing. Anyway, I got to know her. I wouldn't say I got to know the son because he doesn't converse. He doesn't,
Right.
If you ask him a question, he'll say yes. He doesn't have conversations. He does exchange language within his home, but obviously that's within very circumscribed sort of structures. And when I realized that he reads and writes, he has a computer and he collects words and other things.
Right.
He watches cartoons. Nobody knows how it's received, but that's not the point. It's what he does. And I thought he clearly has a relationship with language. And I was very interested in that. And so I wrote a story. This was pre-COVID. I wrote a tiny, I asked her to pick out, she read me a whole list of words and I picked out 4 words just at random for no reason, which grabbed me. And I wrote a tiny story for him, which I think is in the book. I wrote 6 altogether, but only 1 is in the book. I think the first one's in the book. I won't tell you which one it is because none of them are attributed. And I sent it to her and I said, well, maybe you could read it to him. And so she read it to him and videoed herself reading it to him, sent it to me on the phone. And he was listening and he smiled and laughed at the words he recognized. And then I said, do you think he would read it himself? And it hadn't occurred to her, but she asked him to read it, and he did, and they videoed it. And he read it with complete narrative sensibility. In other words, he didn't dart around. He started at the beginning. He appeared to follow the story. And he makes lists of things. So it wasn't a list. So it didn't look like a list.
No.
It looked like a story on a single page. And they videoed him and they were absolutely amazed that he was doing it. Now, I was kind of amazed, but at one level I wasn't at all amazed because I thought this young man has language and you can do things with people who have language, however they may or may not be labelled. Anyway, that then happened. I then told somebody in my family, and I can't remember who, I told them the story of this. And I said, why don't you give me just 4 words off the top of your head and I'll see if I can write a story. I don't remember who it was. I don't remember the words. I don't know which story it was. And that then started it off. And so then I asked other people in the family, and I did a story eventually for the mother of this young man, which is probably one I can identify because the words, she chucked these weird words at me, the weirdest words.
Oh, right, the weirdest ones, right, yes.
Yeah, the weirdest ones, if you discover the weirdest ones. Which one's that?
I can't even pronounce them, really.
Yeah, that's it. You got it. That's her. And it's 66. It probably ought to be 666. And it kind of snowballed from there. And then there were a few people who I came across during that first COVID year, which was obviously horrendous, but Zoom, it has just been utterly amazing. And ironically, COVID made quite a bit of difference to me in my own kind of isolation. And so there are other people, some of them famous, and their names are at the back, and family and a few friends. And so that's how it accumulated. And so each person gave me 4 words, as close to off the top of their head as they could. There are a lot of the same words that repeated. God, they're boring. But on the other hand, I had to do something with them that was not going to be the same. And I had no idea. Each story is riddled with research and stuff I looked up, stuff I remembered, stuff I thought about. And well, you could say the book is, well, you mustn't say it's nuts, because that then becomes the label. But it is weird. I think it's the weirdest, freest thing I've ever written.
Yes.
And this extraordinary French guy who runs an online literary magazine called Fortnightly Review, which again is a legacy from the 50s and the 60s.
Right. Oh, is it? Right.
Yeah, there it is at the bottom. Yeah. And it's both dated and contemporary. But he's amazing. What I did during the course of this year when I was doing the stories, every so often I would send around an email to everyone. Oh, because my great niece put up a website for me, which was really, really fantastic of her, because I would never have been able to do it myself. So I was able to post the stories. And every so often I would send around an email to everyone with a link to the website and say, more stories, have a look if you want to. And then at the end of it, when I thought, right, that's it, closed down, finished, done, I thought, what the hell do I do now? And I thought, nobody in the publishing world, small press or large press, will ever publish this stuff. And because this guy, Dennis, had liked the stories, he said, I didn't ask him directly, but I think I probably said something like, I really want to try and get them published, but I don't know how. And he said, oh, yeah, I'll publish them. So he deserves a gold medal.
Well, yeah.
I think it looks fantastic. I love it.
Absolutely, they do, don't they? And
yeah.
I suppose, I mean, you used a couple of, you say riddled with research, and obviously that's one way of, does suggest the use of the word riddle is obviously interesting, because one way of understanding them are to some extent as riddles.
Yes, but, they are.
Sometimes you, as a reader, you're trying to work out who the persona is of, who am I? I do this, I do this, what am I, and so on. That kind of formal riddle is partly around. But I suppose sometimes the riddle is not so much what am I, but what is this? What is this text? They are sort of meta riddles, or and if that's the right word. But yeah, sometimes the riddle is, what is this text? Is it a joke? Is it an anecdote? Because you call them stories, but
I do.
Some of them are closer to being essays or dream texts.
Are they?
Yeah. But outbursts of nonsense literature, isn't it? You allude.
I beg your pardon.
Nonsense literature. You allude, don't you, to Lear at once or twice?
Yes.
Yes. And get very close to Lear. And then you do etymology, as you say. There's research, so that then they feel like essays. As you say, free association.
But all round the four words, part of the riddle.
Yeah.
Is that the words don't just appear clean or obviously.
No.
When you were talking about typographical stuff and splitting up letters.
Yes.
And sometimes the words are semi-concealed and you have to find them. And sometimes they're made obvious by the way it looks.
Yes.
What's that?
Often you're hiding, as you say, the word has been scrambled and subdivided and then made visible through capitalization.
What, like in Champagne, or a thing at the top?
Well, this is number 72, but
72. Oh, sorry.
Yes, confrontational. You've broken it up, as you say, so that the word is scattered, disseminated across the page.
Yes. Yes, in this case it has I think capital letters. So you have to do a bit of work, and again it does something to the reading. You can read the thing all the way through, and the reason I think, sorry, diversion, the reason I think it's a story is that each one has a beginning, and it does have things that happen, and then it does have an end. But that doesn't mean I'm telling you their stories. I'm just saying that's kind of the form, but anything, any way you read what you think it might be is interesting to me, because I just do not know.
No,
I don't know. And but then if you want to find the words, which most people want to, particularly when it's their words, they get very uptight if they couldn't find their words. And I think, oh my God, have I left a word out? Have I messed this one up? And I have to go back and reread what I've written, because I don't remember what I've written. And I say, no, it's all right, it's there, you've got to look for it. And then they do, and then they like it. I think they probably like their words more than they like the story, but I don't mind that. I don't mind that.
And the point at which they most obviously become stories, I guess, is when they become love stories. One or two of them play with or simply become very beautiful, simple love stories just once or twice, don't they?
Yeah, there's the odd happy ending, isn't there? I think. I can't remember where.
Well, one goes, and one of my favourite lines: "Reader, they married together, they shop in Waitrose."
Oh God, which one is that?
One, it's.
Oh, that's so sweet.
I know, it's very sweet, and characteristic. The Bathos is. That's number 75.
75. Have you got a Waitrose up there?
No, we tend to have Morrison's.
I'm so sorry.
I know, we're very northern. Reader, they married together. So we go from Jane Eyre to Waitrose, which
I don't remember whose story that is at all. Doesn't matter. It's an interesting group of words, though, actually.
Well, you might want to talk to us about that, but it's not untypical, the shifting and the use of Bathos.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I suppose the sort of the descent into the low cultural or the everyday or the popular.
You mean like the telly? You mean the telly?
Well, you do. Yes, you do a lot of telly, don't you?
Yeah,
Britain's Got Talent.
That's me.
Even the novels of Richard Madeley.
Oh, he's in there, you know.
Well, how could he not be?
Well, shall I tell you how he is? I may as well.
You must tell us about Richard Madeley, yes.
My claim to non-fame, although he's now on Good Morning Britain very regularly. I used to go very regularly to this cafe for lunch. And there was one day when I went in and it had a huge table and people sit around the table and it's quite nice, very un-British, very un-English, although it's got little tables as well. And there was this big guy sitting on one corner of the table with a kind of nice, what I would call a little face on a big guy. And I sat down at the kind of neighbouring corner because that was the only place. And we smiled at each other and we started talking and chatting. And he, you know, because you do with a big table sometimes. And it was quite nice and quite jolly and quite jokey. And then this blonde woman came in and came over and gave him a kiss and sat down. I thought, okay, that's the end of a beautiful friendship. And so she started talking to him. And then he kind of included me and said, I was just talking to this lady here. Not many people call me a lady, but anyway. And I said, I haven't asked your name. What's your name? I asked her what's her name when she said Chloe. And I recognised her and it was Chloe Madeley, who's been on telly a lot, and Richard Madeley's daughter. So we, you know, exchanged chat, this, that and the other, this, that and the other. We then said goodbye, exchanged emails, had a little bit of an email exchange, and then COVID hit. And they were very nice and they emailed me and said, if there's anything you need, blah, blah. And I said, well, there may be. And then she said, you can always ask my dad to do shopping for you if you need it, because he loves going shopping. So for the first year of COVID, Richard Madeley once a week brought me some shopping from Waitrose.
No way.
Yes.
That's such a good story.
It's a good story, but now he's gone on to bigger and better things, so it's all over.
Well.
So that's why he's in there, and Chloe is in there, and she's married to James Haskell, the ex-rugby player. Oh. And that's who it was. That's
right. Excellent.
So what was the point of that? Anyway, the point of that was showing off.
Yeah, no, that's there's a lot of point in that. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yes, I say when they become story, the most obvious genre in terms of story is romance, I guess, when I read them.
Okay.
As if in the end that is the only story, as it were, or the story. But I don't know whether that's true.
I don't know. I'd have to reread them.
Right.
I think there are beginnings and endings, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're less obvious. I don't know. I don't know what to say to that, except it's interesting. You may well be completely right. I don't know. But I did once have a go at writing Mills and Boon, and I was completely useless because I was bored stiff. So there's no future there for me.
But there is a buried romance novelist here, though, isn't there? Which is buried occasionally and emerges occasionally, I think, in 81.
Well, it's nice to have a happy ending, but it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Happy endings don't happen very often in life, if at all.
No. And well, maybe you should say more about the comedy, because sometimes they are in themselves a kind of extended joke, or occasionally they contract into jokes like, have I got the magic flu? You ask.
Have I got the what?
The magic flu, you pun on flute.
Oh, do I?
Yes, have I got the magic flu in relation to COVID, and a joke,
really?
the magic flute.
Oh, don't remember that. Well done.
That's a very good joke. Very good joke.
Good joke.
Yeah. So
there are visual jokes.
Yes.
Like the end of, it's only because I'm looking at it, I'll give it away. At the end of number 2, oh yeah, I know whose story that is, which is about chocolate and cream and ice cream. At the end of it, it says a tableau, spelt in the conventional way, on a table, and then brackets AU. So you've got a tableau on a tableau, which is also a tableau on a table. I suppose, I don't know if that's a pun or not. There are funny bits, but of course, you've read it more recently than I have, so.
Well, yes. Well, I like also Mr. Toad enrolling in a creative writing course. I think he runs half of them as well, actually.
Don't tempt me.
But yeah.
I've just been rereading The Wind in the Willows, by the way.
All right. Yeah.
It is an absolutely beautifully written book. Amazing book. Amazing book. I just recommended it to a student online. She's into nature writing.
Right.
I thought she should.
Yes.
Have a look at it.
Yes. Well, I suppose you mentioned nature writing. I suppose one of these texts, I suppose now you make me think about it, I would say, well, are they rather urban or library bound?
Quite probably, because they're all kind of, whatever else they are, they're also about language. I mean, they spin off from 4 random words, random in the sense that I don't know where they come from. They're not random for the person who gave them to me, whether they're aware of that or not. But for me, they are, because I have no idea what's coming from where and why. And it's what I do with the language that they kick off and make into story, narrative, skeins of whatever it is. So,
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any why 4? Or I mean, you have a nice, again, and there is a nice joke in one of them where the line goes something like T.S. Eliot, 4 quartets, that makes 16.
Yes.
Which is very nice. So, and
it's true.
Well, so they tell us, and then and on the back you have a logo, the quotation, the Shakespeare line. I don't know if this is from you or from the publisher, which goes, obviously, the Shakespeare line, there is divinity in odd numbers.
Where's that?
That's on the very reverse of the book.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. Why can't I find it?
In the sort of logo at the top, the circular.
Oh no, that's that is the publisher. That is his permanent logo.
Okay.
These are called odd volumes, this series, which again are based on a series of volumes of stuff, literary stuff that was published in the late 19th century, and they were called odd volumes then.
Ah, there we are. Thank you.
That's the legacy, the publishing legacy.
Well, in defiance, you've written a book for odd volumes that's all about evenness, in that you have a very even number here with 4. It's a square.
81's not even.
No, that's true. It's not, is it? No. What is okay? So, do you want to talk about numbers at all?
Ask me.
Well, if 81 is countering the evenness, you're right. And then you've got your interest in T.S. Eliot's 4 plus 4 quartets and 16 and so on. I'm just wondering why 4, and is there a force to the 4-ness of it all?
It is interesting because initially I picked 4 words at the very beginning for that very first story, which was never going to be anything else. I didn't pick 3. I picked 4. I'd have to think about it, and I don't know if I'd ever have an answer. But in terms of what became the book, because I'd started with 4, I then asked other people for 4.
Yes.
The 4 simply refers on the surface to the 4 words that title each story and that were the impetus for each story. There are 81 stories in the book.
And that's almost arbitrary, was it? You just felt that's enough, or was there any magic numerological logic?
Yes,
81.
but that wasn't the reason. There is a correspondence, but it wasn't the rationale.
What is the correspondence?
Oh God, do I have to tell you?
You have to tell me. I'm not that sharp to understand.
Well, I don't see why I shouldn't, because it doesn't matter, because I've got an indefinite contract with Lancaster.
Oh, I see. Right. Oh, yeah. 81. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
So there is no age of retirement.
No.
Officially.
No. No. Absolutely.
And I see no reason why not. Terry Eagleton carries on. Why shouldn't everybody else? I'm not asking you how old you are. How old are you? I quite like to.
Well, I'm 61, so.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, that's nothing.
Yeah. So there we are. Yeah. Okay. No, there we are. That hence 81. Okay, that makes sense. And this tale has no moral. One line in one of the tales goes, the line goes, this tale has no moral. Are these texts, is this an amoral book?
No, that's a lie. It's got to be a lie. Every text has a moral. We're good Leavesites, one and all. I mean, every text has a moral. We may argue about what it is.
Right.
That's called literary criticism, which we might come on to, or ethical criticism, or any kind of other social or political criticism. But every text will have some kind of moral. Even when it's presenting amorality, it will be pushing something. That's a hell of a generalization, but I think I'd kind of stand for it, given that we haven't got time to run a year-long course.
But you wouldn't, right? Okay, that's interesting. You would, if I said to you, what is the moral of any one of these stories, or would you say, well, no, there isn't a moral, but they are moral? Would you make? You might
no, I could probably. I don't know. If you picked out a particular story and I read it, I could probably have a guess.
Right. Okay.
But I might be wrong. I might be inadequate, and you might find another moral. Because we might be analysing the same things differently,
right?
Or making different connections between the same things which will be there as possibilities, subtext, text, subtext, possible associations from intertextuality. But I am kind of sticking my neck out, but I would probably say that each story probably has some kind of moral. So at some point I might reread them and see if I'm right.
Right.
But I don't know what anybody else might say. So I don't know what you would say, or maybe you would say they're amoral because they mess around such a lot.
I suppose it would be my first instinct, but maybe messing around is in one sense the moral, or is moral, to mess around.
Not always.
There's a great line in Walter Benjamin. Yeah, Walter Benjamin, who says, God is the great flaneur because he's resting. He's still resting. He's, after 6 days of creation, he's still putting his feet up. So
typical.
There we are. Men.
Leaving some woman to do the washing up.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, that's Mrs. God. Okay. Well, okay. You've gestured toward criticism there and Leavis. And Leavis's fascination with the moral task, if you like, the critic, or logic of literary criticism. Okay, so you're a writer, you're an author, you're a poet, you're a dramatist, librettist, short storyist, and then you've also more than once in your career said, okay, well, let's think about what criticism is, particularly in relation to the creative writing or imaginative writing as a discipline. There's not just perhaps something that happened, and it's a text that's studied, but as a live discipline. Okay, so do you want then to say a little bit more why you are determined to ride the two horses, if you will, just to start, why you're determined to remain on the horse of literary, the horse of criticism or literary theory?
Gosh, wait a minute, let me find a way into this. How do I find a way into this? Can you help me find a way into this?
Well,
yeah, please.
Okay, well, which is better? Okay, Matthew Arnold, the critical power is of lower rank than the creative.
Yeah.
The critical power is, so for Arnold, poet's there, the critic is there. There seems to be no argument. So if you're a poet, why bother descending to the status of being a mere critic or a mere theorist?
Okay, no, that's interesting, because I obviously I could have included more and other bits from Arnold, but there are two bits in there. And in terms of the language that he is using of the time, his push is that culture, what he calls culture, and what he then is specific about by calling poetry, is what really gives criticism of life a guidance, what Leavis then and others picked up then as a possibility of some kind of moral guidance as to what life is about, how to live it, and our culture, our literature essentially will supposedly give us that. Now, when Arnold talks about poetry, poetry is both poetry in the sense that he means it, short lines, formal conventions, flexible uses, possibilities within language, which are not defined by prose and sentence-based meaning. But it is also shorthand for literature, what we would now call literature, even though people will argue about what it is, what are the boundaries of genres and all that kind of stuff. And he is opposing culture in some ways to the developing importance of science. And so again, culture is not terribly clearly defined. He doesn't say it's art by Caravaggio, but not by David Hockney. Not that Hockney was around then, as far as I know. So he's not making value judgments about particular aspects of culture, but he's really making a call for what we now generally call culture and the arts as guidance. I'm not convinced from other things he's written that he really does devalue the so-called critical that far below the so-called creative. And so I think it's a kind of rhetorical and a moral gesture that he's making, which doesn't justify it, and it doesn't negate, it doesn't do away with what has become oppositional between so-called creative, so-called critical, which is partly why, although in the past, way back before creative writing really became any kind of accepted academic discipline, I reread things I'd written and I would use the word creative in passing, but not the way in which it's become kind of institutionalized and fetishized now. And that is why my general preference, where I can do it, or where I do it, is to talk about imaginative writing, because if you like, the imaginative mode of thought is rather different from, if you like, the empirical, fact-driven, certain kinds of analytical modes of thought. And it is fetishized. Creativity is fetishized, as if there is something so special about it. And that becomes then problematic within the teaching of creative writing, which I'm sure we don't have time to discuss in any detail, but I've written about, which is that if you have it, you lack other things. And then there are correctives to that, which is people saying, well, no, you have to have a critical approach to what you're writing in order to know how to improve what you're writing. But the whole confusion around the word creativity has become, I think, very, very problematic, culturally speaking. So my general preference is to use the word imaginative. But of course, with the book, I haven't said critical imaginative writing, because I'm, if you like, trying to desperately make some tiny intervention into what has now become the academic discipline. Sorry, that's a slightly rambly answer.
No.
But of course, if just leaping ahead to Leavis into the 20th century, into the 20s, the 30s, and then staggering on till the 50s, his passion, his focus, everything is about what we call literature, the novel in particular, although poetry as well, not really drama so much. But it is about the critical take, the criticism that it is possible to apply to that literature, that creative output product, hate the word output, but what is produced as literature, as the creative. So, and that is a line. The idea of a criticism of life, which Leavis also picks up, then becomes melded with a criticism of literature. And I think what he always hoped and maybe believed, and maybe thought he was doing, was that if you can criticize literature, then you have the ability to criticize life. However, just to add a little coda to that, for Leavis, as it was for other movements in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in the revival of early music, which I've done a lot of stuff, played, but also written about, there was a golden ageism, this idea that if you could hark back to a golden age, which would tend to be the first Elizabethan age, you would then have a clue to what was valuable in our present life, which is potty. But the things are interwoven. So I don't think in the end Arnold is that divided, although he is phrasing it in a way that then supposedly was taken up by C.P. Snow in The Opposition of the Two Cultures, which is not really what that book is about. It's a much more interesting book than its reputation has given it, because he's not anti-literature, he's not anti-science. He's actually arguing for ways of putting them into dialogue with each other, which is kind of, in its relatively small, but I think maybe important way, was where I was aiming to go with this. Not by venturing into literary theory, because there are enough anthologies of that stuff, and many of them are absolutely fantastic. But there is nothing, I don't think there's anything. There is nothing which really looks at the history of the way in which pre-literary theory literature has been discussed and thought about. And that's really what it's not just the history of literary criticism. It's not that, although that is what it kind of moves into that. It's about the way in which imaginative writing, way thinkers and critics, philosophers have tried to come to grips with what imaginative writing is and might be. And you could say some of it is like theorizing with a little t, but it's not theorizing in the sense that it became after the 60s and 70s in Western thought. It's quite a long answer.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. And as you say, there's Plato, Montaigne, and so on, all sorts of figures, indeed starting with the Bible, reflecting on themes that are crucial to what we might now call literary theory. I suppose going back to the Arnold thing, okay, the Arnold line, one Arnold line obviously is that literature is a criticism of life, and you alluded to that, didn't you? Literature is a criticism of life. Yes. Well, if literature is a criticism of life, then one might say, well, why have criticism? Isn't literature doing the work of criticism? So what role, why on earth do we bother with criticism?
Okay, no, interesting question. But then how would you ever define, or how would you ever begin to approach what kind of criticism of life literature is? So let's think of an example.
Okay.
Jane Eyre is a criticism of life.
Okay.
Auden's poem, Lay Your Sleeping Head, My Love, Human on My Faithless Arm, or Human on Your Faithless Arm, can't remember, is a criticism of life.
Right.
They both convey their message, their moral, their main themes. They're conveying different things. In order to know what they are, literary criticism made inroads on that. There have been other ways of approaching as well. People study the slave trade and have other ways of approaching Mansfield Park, for example, with the insights that gives, and that is extra literary. That's social and political and historical. But you have to be able to disentangle the literary text if you are going to claim that it is a criticism of life. And I suppose that was in their way, the Leavis and his wife Q.D. Leavis and the Scrutiny Group. That's what they were kind of aiming to do. They could never quite do it completely because they were separating, not all the time, but they were mostly separating the literature from the literature's context. So quite how it becomes a criticism of life, well, I don't know. I'm probably not well enough read in every single word or remember every single word. I don't know how it becomes a criticism of life, unless it is to do with harking back to a golden age when, and this is complete rubbish, when all classes were united and they all believed the same and they all lived happily together. Some may have been dying in the plague in hovels and others were in palaces eating beef with French names. But nevertheless, denying social and cultural differences, saying, let us relive a golden age. And that's what this literature, that's what this music gives us. That's what it shows us. Now, how it does that, I don't know. And when I was at Cambridge, I don't think anybody ever revealed it.
Yeah, there is something strange about that word life, isn't there? For it seems,
yes.
It's almost fetishized. Okay, that was a really nice, helpful answer to my question about the Arnold thing. So you have just there very neatly disentangled, in a way, criticism and literature, perhaps vis-a-vis life, and or put them together again, I suppose, or found a place for criticism within the literary within literature. And that's in part one of your big themes, isn't it? That you want to see, as you say, creative writers doing scholarship, and you want to see scholars writing creatively, to paraphrase you from the preface.
Well, yeah, that's not me. I mean, I take the point, but if I can just quote that little bit.
Oh, yes, please. Yes,
the end of my introduction, where I'm quoting the creative writing workshop. Mm-hmm. Don't get me started. It was oh God. Well, obviously it had to come into being, or it wouldn't. But then we could speak to the Lord about that. It was established pretty well at Iowa in the States in the 1920s, mm-hmm. and it became the model, not always implemented in the same way, but mostly for the way creative writing is largely taught. And there was a critic and historian called Norman Forster. This was in America, and there was a newly established school of letters at the University of Iowa, and he wrote, "Creative writing at Iowa was never intended to become a freestanding apparatus of courses, an autonomously constituted, quote, workshop leading to a separate degree. It was to be only one branch of study in the literary tradition, designated for all types of students, teachers, critics, scholars, and writers. The school's curriculum was to be a sequence of courses in non-contemporary texts and authors, criticism, literary history, and even the history and structure of the English language. Creative writers would do scholarship, scholars would creatively write." Now that's an ideal. Very, very occasionally, some universities, I think, try and do that. UEA kind of tried when they set up their MA in 1970, MA in creative writing, kind of tried to do that to some extent, but they had a slightly different, Malcolm Bradbury and Angus Wilson had a slightly different purpose as well, which was to intervene in what they saw as a kind of degenerating British novel, as against the American counterpart, which they saw as thriving and exciting. And they really wanted lots of new young writers to produce new, young, wonderful 20th century literature in 1970 to compete with the Americans. So they had that as a kind of ideological aim, as well as the genuine disciplinary desire to combine the literary and the critical, the imaginative, creative, and the critical. It's very hard to do, because part of what happened as creative writing became established were all sorts of tensions between English literary studies and the new creative writing people. Can I just go and collect something from the door? Somebody's just delivering. I'll be 30 seconds.
That's okay.
So and this book isn't going to answer all of that, but it does put together material which led up in many ways, some of which to literary theory, but isn't literary theory, literary cultural theory, because I haven't included those except a tiny bit at the end. Nor is it the bulk staple of creative writing reading lists, which are how-to books, basically. Or this is how I do it, or this is how I did it. But it is in between, because it is about the way in which, across the centuries, people have tried to think about and write about imaginative writing. And so much of that actually feeds into the way creative writing, bits of creative writing are discussed. So the kind of example that I give at the beginning, and you mentioned the Bible, the Old Testament, you've got the two opposing things to do with one of the mantras of creative writing is write what you know. Okay, which can be interpreted different ways. It can be interpreted as write from your experience, write from what you know about the world, but it's mimetic in some form, even if it gets transformed in some ways. And at the beginning, you've got the Bible saying, thou shalt not make any graven images, right? No imitation. And then it says, God made man, so-called, in his own image, imitation. There's a Yiddish phrase for that. Do you speak Yiddish?
No, alas, no.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else at Lancaster does. Okay, no, there's an English equivalent, which is go figure.
All right, yeah, which you do use.
Go figure.
Yeah.
And then mimesis continues to be a real issue through the discussions in classical literature, then schools so-called of naturalism and realism, particularly in the 19th century, into the novel as we know her, begin to know her. And then we come to the mantra, write what you know. Now there's a line of thought that goes through, which is imperfect, and it goes here, there, and everywhere, and it struggles. But there is a line that goes through, which is a historical understanding of the way in which thinking about imaginative writing has taken place. And creative writing, I would say, generally has very little sense of its own history, if anything at all. I mean, people will read novels, they'll read, if they are directed to, that were written in the past. But there's no historic sensibility about what the discipline is or how it became it. And you could say, what does it matter? Because they're just there to write. Well, I think it matters because I think I think it's important to know about one's history and the history of what one's doing, because it changes the way you think about it. It influences, it could change the way you think. You could say no graven images. Everything is total fantasy, unreal, non-empirical. Or you could say, no, literature is an imitation of life. Realistic, is it? Or is it naturalistic? Are we trying to put life on paper? Are we trying to put life into narrative? Is life about telling stories? It's another thing I don't like. Life isn't about telling stories, because that begins to imply that we invent our histories. And that's very different from a discussion about what we might remember, what we might be able to fix, what we might be able to analyze and understand by knowing more. So that's really my take. Not in a nutshell, but a little bit strung out.
Okay. Maybe one last question then. You wanted to talk about imaginative writing rather than creative writing, having various problems with the word creative or how it's been used or stolen. What about then? What is the imagination? What is the difference between imagination and the creative, or what is the imagination? You got that wonderful line, isn't there, from Coleridge in your that you include in the anthology. The imagination is the repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am, which is one take on the imagination. If I said to you, what is the imagination? Would you want to answer? How would you answer?
Well, it's interesting, and I will attribute because it was worth attributing. I wrote a book called, what was it called? The Author is Not Dead, Merely Somewhere Else. And the subtitle was Creative Writing Reconceived. And that was published in 2008. And it presented a much, I mean, it's there a bit in the introduction to the reader, but a much longer account of the history and establishment of creative writing in the academy, its relationship with English studies, and all sorts of things like that. And I think I'd nearly finished it, I can't remember, and I was somewhere with some people, and a student well, how old would he have been? I don't know, maybe 20. And so I was describing, he was saying, what's creative writing? So I was talking about it. I was trying to explain to him what it was that happened, what was taught, what students did. And he said, so it's a mode of thought, is what he said. And I've used that phrase because I thought it was spot on. And so I suppose I would describe it as an imaginative mode of thought, which each of us has as part of our mental faculties, abilities, potentials. When it comes to pinning it down in terms of what then becomes, let's call it imaginative literature, what we call imaginative writing, what we call literature, that block, which Terry Eagleton dissects very well to show where the overlaps and the blurrings can and can't be, because it is all about language, uses different forms, formulations of language. You could say it is fundamentally about what cannot ever totally be empirically verifiable. Okay, now you write a historical novel and there'll be stuff in there that could be empirically verifiable from historical research documents, bits of paper, which is what we call empirical, that is supposed to be provable from evidence, empirical evidence that we can point to. But there will be stuff that either never happened, you can't ever know whether it would have happened or did happen or could happen. And that's going from, if you like, a kind of writing, historical novel writing, in which you can point to something that in another discipline is called history, and which has pretty rigorous constraints and frameworks within which it is and can be done. So, you know, Shakespeare's Dark Lady, well, not Shakespeare's Dark Lady. Yeah, no, Shakespeare's Dark Lady of the Sonnets will do. Uh-huh. No, that won't do at all. But anyway, no, it won't do at all as an example. So, of course, I can't think of an example. But I think that's what stamps it as distinctive from other modes of thought. And again, that is very crude, and philosophers would do far better than me in, I think, making inroads in that, because I'm not a linguistic philosopher by any stretch of the imagination or fact. That isn't what I am, and I can't do that kind of stuff anyway. But I think as a kind of workable definition, it is a mode of thought which can be distinguished from other modes of thought that are used in intellectual engagement, intellectual activity. So that's how I would define the difference. Now, you could then extrapolate from that and say creative writing is then the practical disciplinary application of that imaginative mode of thought. And I think that would probably be quite valid. Fairly valid, a bit valid.
That was a fascinating answer, a brilliant one. And valid we'll take as a good word to finish on.
Okay.
So thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I will now stop the recording, and then they can.
Can I just say something?
Oh, yes, you can.
I'm enormously grateful for all the time that you have put in to looking at these books and coming up with this stuff, because I've never discussed any of this with anyone.
My pleasure.
So thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. My pleasure. And let me try and stop the recording now.